Alright, so let's see if we can finish this up here just in the next couple of minutes. So we kind of talked about how the neutrality after 1939 led to a cash and carry provision that favored the Allies, and the British could come and get the warships, and we in return would get uh, military bases around the globe. Now, not everyone agreed with FDR's kind of policy of being pro-allies. Remember, there was obviously a lot of immigration in the United States. There were some in favor of the Germans. You had plenty that were in favor of the dictatorships of Europe because of the failures of democracy, because of the Great Depression and all that fun stuff. Uh, so there's a large debate that starts to kind of engulf American politics in the 1930s between whether we should be isolationists or whether we should be interventionists. And there was even a committee put together that was called the America First Committee that were true isolationists, that the United States should not get involved in the war or conflict in any means whatsoever. But as more and more Americans began to understand what the war was doing to our European allies, and the conditions were being described, that started to convince Americans that we at least needed to prepare to defend ourselves in the case that we got involved in the war in some way, shape, or form. And there was a CBS News reporter named Edward Murrow, the guy that you actually were listening to in video 2 during that radio broadcast. And as he brought more and more news from London into the homes of the Americans became shocked, essentially out of neutrality, by the time that Pearl Harbor gets attacked on December 7th, 1941. So as the conditions continue to worsen overseas in Europe, and even keep in mind that the Japanese are over attacking areas throughout the Pacific, trying to gain more and more territory for themselves, Roosevelt gives this speech to Congress on January 6th, 1941, and he highlights 4 freedoms that are precious to Americans that are being threatened by the Germans and the Japanese and their militarism in different parts of the world. And I think we all agree that these are some serious freedoms that us as Americans sometimes take for granted, but they are the kind of the backbone of what it means to be American. This freedom of speech, the freedom to worship, the freedom from want, and the freedom from fear. And after this speech, if you weren't a interventionist at this point, more and more people start shifting their attitude towards becoming interventionists versus becoming isolationists. FDR stated that in order to protect these freedoms, in the early stages we must help England, but we also must prepare our country for the potential of going to war. Congress will take one more step, towards aiding the British in March of 1941. So this is only roughly 6 or 7 months or so before we actually get involved in the war. March 1941, we passed the Lend-Lease Act. And symbolically, it's numbered 1776, which if you think back to September, that should ring a bell to you, because that's when we declare our independence from England. So 1776, it amounted to essentially an economic declaration of war. By the end of the war in 1945, we had spent $40 billion in aid for the English in World War II. So the Lend-Lease Act is kind of a next step towards us in this policy of cash and carry in financial and military aid for the British in World War II. But even by the point of March 1941, there were still plenty of Americans that were divided on our involvement, period, in the war, not just our involvement with helping the British, because they felt that if we showed our cards and aided the British more and more, then eventually the United States would get attacked. Now, we were, but it wasn't by the Germans, as you know. It was the attack on Pearl Harbor against with the Japanese. The Japanese didn't have any issue, I guess you could say, with the Lend-Lease Act, because that was aiding the British who were fighting the Germans. So our ignorance, I guess you could say, believing that the Japanese would never dare to attack us in the Pacific, led exactly to that, a attack in the Pacific by the Japanese. You also have the weak League of Nations that could really do anything to stop the aggression of these totalitarian states. Benito Mussolini in Italy, you have Joseph Stalin, obviously, in the Soviet Union, and then Hitler in Germany. They just continued to practice appeasement in the early stages, and by the time they realized that they needed to stand up against Hitler, it was too late. Because they feared involvement in another war, that the fact that they believed the Soviet Union, because of communism, was a greater threat than Nazi Germany is another issue there. Our fear and blindness of communism kind of led us to oversee the issues of what was going on in Germany, because Hitler, in the beginning, was providing jobs, and he was providing food for the people, and he was reforming the society, but under the surface, he was creating a society that hated a specific group of people and were willing to go to war to defend that. And the League of Nations, which was designed to prevent war, so you can come to the table diplomatically to speak about the problems, couldn't do anything by the time they realized that something was needed to be done. And the United States, as we know, was not part of the League of Nations. So in August of 1941, Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill are going to sign the Atlantic Charter. They actually met on a warship off the coast of Newfoundland, which is in Canada. And this not only deepens the alliance between the two nations, but it established an international system of general security. The fact that these two countries kind of go hand in hand with each other, and a war was not going to separate us. When we get to the fall of 1941 and German submarines are starting to fire on American ships in the Atlantic, primarily because we're aiding the British, killing roughly 100 American sailors. That's kind of going to be one of the final straws, because Roosevelt is going to order our Navy to attack on any U-boat that they see in the Atlantic. That's a declaration of war without a declaration of war. The fact that he's telling our military to attack anybody that they deem German or U-boats or whatever, that's saying you have my authorization to attack, which was a declaration of war. Hitler wasn't blind to the actions, but he wanted to do everything possible, within reason, to prevent the United States from getting involved in the war. Unfortunately, the Japanese didn't share his same strategy, because they do attack Pearl Harbor, and that is actually where we will pick up, hopefully, tomorrow. Once again, I do apologize for not being in class. You can probably still tell from my voice that I can't breathe out of my nose at all right now. Luckily, I haven't been coughing, but I have a giant pile of Kleenexes here, and my sleep has been awful as well. So I'm going to do my best to now that I'm done with you guys with these lessons for you, I'm going to get some rest, and hopefully I'll see you guys tomorrow. Make sure you get all your assignments done, including the battles of World War II, and prepare yourself for a quiz tomorrow. I want to let you know in advance, because I want you to actually take these notes seriously. 1, for your state test, and 2, so that way you're able to discuss with me here as we finish through the rest of World War II till the end of the week. All right? Have a great day, guys, and I'll see you later.